One of the first things I'll ask somebody new when they come in is, why are you here? And I don't say, why are you here? I say, what are you looking for? What do you feel like you need? What is it that you're trying to do that you can't do? Because part of my job is to really zero in on what somebody needs. Of course, there's fundamentals of what you need to be able to learn how to play an instrument. That's a given, but everyone's needs are not the same. The needs of a performing songwriter are different from the needs of somebody who really is interested in being a guitar player first. Someone who wants to do both is going to work on both of those things. So the first thing is to be clear about what are you working on, and whether you're working with me or anybody else, you definitely want to have a sense of whether you're clear on what you need and whether the person you're working with is able to tune in, figure out what that is, and effectively communicate that to you. There are people who teach who have a routine and a curriculum that they follow, and that's great, especially with beginners. But if you teach the same thing to everybody who comes in, then I'm not sure you're doing your job. So you want to be clear about that. You want to make sure the person you're working with is clear about that. Now, with that said, let's say we're talking about a performing songwriter. Well, the most important aspect of a guitar for a performing songwriter is being able to accompany yourself. So somebody like that, I might work in a lesson with them on specifically their songs and how to take, we'll do a lot of things like listen to a recording, a demo that they did, or a professional CD they did with professional musicians, and say, okay, you need to learn how to emulate this. So how are we going to put that across? Find a way to translate that band sound to a single guitar. And that's going to be all about your rhythm and your timing. Now, if you're a performing songwriter, an active musician creating, then hopefully you're spending a good amount of time with that instrument in your hands to begin with. So the thing that you want to do in between lessons is to have a clear sense of what you took away from that lesson every day. And if that means taking notes, which most of my students do, some of them I need to make a list for them specifically. Here are the things that you are thinking about. It's important to me that when you walk out the door of my studio, you know what you're supposed to do. You know what you need to focus on. But you go and you practice one of two ways. Either you practice very mindfully, which is different from a performance approach because you're not really just thinking about the flow and putting it out there. You are thinking about something that has to do with the mechanics of how your hands work. So let's say there's a particular chord that isn't quite in your fingers yet. Well, you need to break that down. You need to look at what the individual movements are that allow you to get there. You need to tune in to what's happening with your fingers. I was in a lesson with a student recently, and we were working on finger picking, and I made an offhand remark to her. I said, what we're really doing is educating your thumb. And she thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard, and she went and tweeted it. So the specific of that thing was that she needed to sit down and practice with the exercises that I gave her, working with her thumb and knowing where it was. Now, most people don't have 3 hours a day to practice the guitar. But the thing about that kind of very focused work is that you can spend 15 minutes, if you are able to zero in, if you've got that laser focus going on what you're doing, then 15 minutes of concentrated practice is very powerful and will do you much, much more good than 3 hours on the couch with the TV on. And so if you spend a certain amount of time, and it can be as little as 10 or 15 minutes, with that very specific focus on a particular technical aspect, then you can move away from that. As long as you do that consistently, you do it ideally maybe a couple of times a day, 2 or 3 times a day for very short bursts where you can maintain that concentration, and you do it every day, that will allow you to absorb those things because you're really training your muscles. You really are training your muscles, developing muscle memory. but it doesn't take endless repetition. Certain things do. Certain things you just have to play. I mean, one thing I tell beginners when they'll say, well, how long will it take me for me to really get this together? I say, your job is to make friends with it. Your job is to get comfortable with the instrument in your hands. So just spend as much time as you can with the instrument in your hands. Now, that's different from that very concentrated laser focus practice. But most people can only sustain that kind of concentration for X amount of time. And so you have to stay aware of that. When is it time to move on from educating your thumb or figuring out how to get from point A to point B by recognizing which fingers you're moving and where? But moving on from there to, okay, now I'm practicing flow. So now I'm going to get up in front of a mirror and I'm going to play my song, or I'm going to video myself playing this song. And I'm going to think about, what did we talk about in the lesson? One of the things I spend a lot of time talking about with performing songwriters is how to use the strumming hand to generate a groove and get as much sound and variation in sound out of the guitar. And I see a lot of people with postural issues, that maybe the guitar they're playing is too big for them. So the right shoulder's up like that. Maybe you're a smaller framed person with a large guitar, and so your arm's out like here. And so when you go to strum, this is happening. You're never going to be able to make something sound good or feel good. And my advice to people always is, there's a difference between awkward because it's unfamiliar and awkward because it's awkward. And when you start to look at those things, so say you get home and you're practicing your song, well, get in front of a mirror and see yourself and look at your shoulders and look and see, does the instrument look comfortable in your hands? And when you swing your arm, is it fluid? Does it look like you're dragging your hand? I see people strumming like this all the time. And they say, oh, it doesn't sound good. Well, they're not necessarily aware that instead of just making a fluid motion, they're doing this. They're unaware of how the muscles work. Well, that's not the same as that very zeroed in, looking at this one little aspect of what your fingers are doing. That's a whole body thing. So you spend a certain amount of time. The mirror is really, really helpful. Video is really, really helpful that way. You play the song beginning to end, and you don't necessarily stop yourself and say, oh, I've got to fix my shoulder. You can't get through a whole song thinking constantly about your shoulder. It's going to take away from your performance. But you spend a short period of time looking at that, being aware of it. And the habit you develop through this kind of practice is what I call checking in, which is just recognizing that there are certain things that are going to help you play better, come across better on stage. It affects your presence, it affects the sound of your instrument. It really impacts everything about the performance. And I do it all the time in my own playing. I check in. Like every other guitar player, you play guitar for 30-some years, well, your shoulders are going to tend to develop a little bit of a guitar player slouch sometimes. That's a norm. But at the same time, I've studied bodywork, postural alignment, things like that. There's something called Alexander technique, which is wonderful for learning about this stuff, and that's a whole other lesson that we could get into, but it has to do with how you carry the body and get it to support itself. So my check-in is, where's my neck? Where's my head? And am I doing this when I don't have to? You don't need to be watching your fingers all the time. You can feel where things are, especially if you're strumming and you're staying down in the lower positions and you're not really moving up and down the neck very much. You don't need to have your eyes here. But the check-in just means asking yourself the question every once in a while. And you develop that by practicing the performance. And when something is brand new to you, yes, you're going to spend more time thinking about it, and you might have to focus on it more. So maybe that's part of your more focused practice. You could sort of think in 3 tiers. You do your 10 or 15 minutes of very specific grunt work, and you accept the fact that this is what's necessary. But if you look at it as an opportunity to focus in on something besides all the other chaos and all the other concerns in your life. And all I'm going to think about right now is educating my thumb. As silly as that might sound, it's kind of meditative. It's when you get into that, you can spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes there. That's stage one. Stage two is putting those things into practice in the context of a song, but at the same time being mindful of the way that you're moving, and this is generally going to deal more with larger muscle movements. So it has to do with the movement of the strumming hand. It has to do with things like making sure the shoulder isn't up when the fretting hand is working, making sure you're not gripping too hard. But because those things need to happen in real time, you've got to practice it in the context of playing the song. That's stage two. Stage three is being able to flow through the entire song, use your check-in every so often. And it's going to be, for me, it's the moments in between verses, it's turnarounds, it's things like that where I'm not singing. Excuse me. Although I was not someone who was gifted with a natural voice. I've learned how to be a good singer, and I have a lot of people to thank for that, from whether I studied with them specifically or just learned from listening to them or watching them or whatever. I have check-ins for singing also, and that's happening while I'm singing, obviously. But the guitar check-ins tend to be, okay, when do I have a moment? I'm going to step back from the microphone, and I'm just going to think about how I'm standing, and am I relaxed here? And on stage, things just sort of tend to take over. That's okay. Your practice is preparation for the stage. And that stage three practice is I am acting like I'm on stage, and I am going through the flow. So what I'm practicing is getting from beginning to end smoothly and being able to, at least using the check-in, be mindful of the things I need to be mindful of without interrupting what I'm really trying to put across. Then when you get on stage, you've done the work and it's there. And you do it every day. And that is how you make friends with this thing hanging around your neck, is you hang out with it. How do you make friends with anybody else? It's the same thing.